am beautiful, and I know I'm beautiful.
One freezing night in 1967, drag performers from across the country gathered in a cramped theater for a pageant that would forever change the face of drag. And by a stroke of luck, as well as some clever marketing, a documentary crew happened to be there and managed to capture a moment that foreshadowed the creation of New York drag houses and the ball culture that we recognize today from Paris is Burning and Drag Race.
Damn it, I'm beautiful, and I know I'm beautiful.
All aboard and welcome to Matt Baum's Culture Cruise, where we take a deep dive on LGBTQ milestones in entertainment that changed the world. This month, we're taking a look at 1968's The Queen, a documentary that captured the realities of gay life in the 1960s, as well as a pivotal confrontation that helped shape queer culture for decades to come. Thanks to everyone who makes Culture Cruise possible with a pledge of support on Patreon, folks like Roy Marvin, Megan Brannon, and Brian Blau. If you're enjoying these videos, head over to patreon.com/Matt Baum to check out the rewards for backers, like early ad-free access to videos, stickers and books in the mail, and more. And before we get started, just a quick heads up, we're going to be talking about some historical culture in this video that includes some slurs, just so you're ready for that. It's late February 1967, and drag performers from all over the country are descending on number 5 East 73rd Street in New York City, one block outside the 60-block perimeter where drag was until recently an arrestable offense. They're here to compete in the Miss All-American Camp Beauty pageant, produced by ballroom circuit superstar Flawless Sabrina.
My name is Jack, but I work under the name of Sabrina.
Jack started hosting drag pageants in Philadelphia in 1958 when he was just 19 years old. From the 50s into the 60s, he built up a drag show empire that toured the country with a staff of about 100 people working full-time. Many of the towns he visited had banned drag shows, and sometimes the police would arrest him, drive him to city limits, and tell him to never come back. But sometimes Jack was able to make a deal. If they allowed the show to go ahead, he'd use it as a fundraiser and make a donation to some local charity. After 10 years of many shows and many arrests, Jack was ready for something big. He wanted to throw his largest drag contest yet in New York City to benefit the biggest charity he could find, which at the time was the Muscular Dystrophy Association, chaired by the wife of the vice president, Lady Bird Johnson. Through some amazing and incredibly unlikely powers of persuasion, Jack managed to arrange a drag pageant at New York's Town Hall, co-sponsored by the First Lady of the United States, along with Sammy Davis Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, to be judged by Judy Garland. But things didn't quite work out the way anyone expected. First, a little context on drag pageants in New York. Although this particular show was prominently captured on film, it certainly wasn't the first of its kind. In fact, drag pageants go back 100 years to the 1860s and the annual Oddfellows Ball at the Hamilton Lodge in Harlem. Every year, hundreds and eventually thousands of people would gather, dressed in drag, walking for judges, competing in categories, winning trophies. Today, we use the word queer to describe the culture of those kinds of events, but in the 1920s, they had a very different name. They were referred to, affectionately, as faggot balls. This was in the midst of a period where queer culture was suddenly very fashionable. It was known at the time as the pansy craze. At their height in the 1930s, 8,000 people attended the Oddfellows Ball. But as those balls grew in popularity and size, police started to crack down. And for a time, Mayor LaGuardia ordered police to arrest all female impersonators between 14th and 72nd Street. That shut down a lot of the city's queer culture, but it left a few neighborhoods untouched. Among them, Harlem and Greenwich Village. One other thing made these pageants extraordinary. They were at least somewhat integrated. Black and white attendees competed together. But they weren't exactly colorblind contests. Black contestants were expected to lighten their skin in order to compete, and for the first 69 years of the Oddfellows Ball, no black performers ever won first prize. The Oddfellows Ball ended in the late 1930s, in part because of police pressure and also a moral panic over cross-dressing. And for a while, drag culture had to go underground in New York, really only ready to re-emerge during the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So that's the context in which this pageant was to take place. Jack, aka Sabrina, was a master promoter and managed to spread the word about his upcoming extravaganza very effectively. Word eventually reached some documentary filmmakers, and they all started working together to produce a documentary about the show. Almost immediately, the celebrities who'd been booked found reasons that they couldn't attend. So while organizers scrambled to find replacements, including Andy Warhol, the filmmakers scrambled to figure out what their movie would even be. It opens with the participants arriving and meeting each other.
I run these contests all over America, from Boston to the Ozarks. And drag queens are all the same. You get them together, it's like a convention.
Watching the documentary now, I'm struck by just how much it's like RuPaul's Drag Race. This scene where they're all seeing each other for the first time is exactly like the workroom meetings at the start of every season. They're sizing each other up, hearing the rules, learning how they'll be judged.
5 points for walk, 5 points for talk, 5 for bathing suit, 5 for gown, 5 for makeup and hairdo, and 10 for beauty.
They unpack their drag together just like on Drag Race. They learn group choreography like a Drag Race challenge. They even face possible elimination.
If you are difficult or uncooperative, you may be dropped from the contest.
As the performers get settled in at the hotel, the camera lingers on one particular contestant, Harlow. And one note here, when this was filmed, Harlow presented as a boy named Richard, but in the early 70s she came out as trans, and after that she went by Rachel. Ordinarily, I wouldn't bring up those details, but other people in the documentary refer to her as Richard, so I'm mentioning it now so you know who they're talking about. Harlow was relatively new to the pageants, but she was a longtime friend of Sabrina's from Philadelphia. And as a viewer, you can't help but notice that both the filmmakers and the pageant organizers seem to devote a lot of attention to her.
I can't help but feel a certain responsibility for Richard.
Harlow barely speaks more than a few words out loud for most of the documentary, but the other performers have lots to say, and in their hotel room conversations before the pageant, they provide an invaluable record of what queer life was like in the 1960s. For example, they talk about serving in the military, or more accurately, not serving.
Well, you know, this friend of mine went to the draft board. Well, I was just talking to him, and I said, why haven't you been drafted? And he said, well, I have been. And I said, well, did you tell them that you were homosexual? He said, no, they told me.
Generally speaking, queer people have not been particularly welcome in the Army. Although, quick side note, the man that George Washington selected to lead the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, maintained relationships with men that most historians today believe were romantic. But setting that aside, at the time that the Queen was made, the Army prohibited gay people from serving. A decade earlier, the military had commissioned a secret document called the Crittenden Report to investigate what were then called sex perverts. The report recommended that gay people be barred from the military on moral grounds, but the Army denied that that report even existed until 1976. Why 1976? Well, that was around the time that Leonard Matlovich came out.
On March 6, Sergeant Leonard Matlovich disclosed to a supervising officer at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia that he was a homosexual and wanted to stay in the Air Force.
Matlovich was a Vietnam War veteran, a recipient of the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star, and he was the first openly gay man to challenge the military's ban on gay service members. At the time, a lot of Americans couldn't conceive of gay people wanting to serve in the military, but some of the contestants in The Queen talk openly about wishing that they could join. Remember, this was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and public opinion hadn't really turned against the war in large numbers until just around the time that The Queen was filmed.
And I wrote a long letter to the president stating I wanted to go into the Army. I wanted to go not because I was a homosexual, because there were men there. I wanted to help protect our country. Simple as that. So I got a letter back and stated that they understood and they couldn't have me in the Army as of yet. Maybe one day they'll see things right and I could get in.
From the time that this was filmed, it would be another 43 years before the ban was lifted. By coming out, Leonard and service members like him helped lay the groundwork for a change that took decades to finally come to pass. A change Leonard wouldn't live to see, having passed away in 1988.
He will be buried in Washington, D.C., and his chosen epitaph is already on his gravestone. When I was in the military, they gave me a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving 1.
As they get ready for the pageant, the performers also discuss gender and the possibility of transitioning, although they don't use the kind of language that we would use today.
Well, I have enough money to go through the sex change, and I live only 30 miles from Johns Hopkins. But it's the last thing I would want.
The possibility of getting an operation, what they called a sex change then, and today we call gender confirmation, was still a pretty new idea at the time. Johns Hopkins Hospital had opened a gender clinic the year before this was filmed, first in secret, but word got out pretty fast. It was the first facility of its kind in America. Before Johns Hopkins, you had to travel to another country for gender therapy, but suddenly a predecessor to the therapies we have today was available for the first time to more people than ever before. And then there's this interesting moment in the conversation.
Well, my husband is in the service, and he's in Japan now.
And that's not the only time someone mentions a husband. When they're talking about how their parents found out they're gay.
Jerry, when did yours find out? Well, I got my second husband, I think, when I took him home. And he stayed on for the duration for about 3 years. They finally figured it out.
Husbands? Now, obviously, these weren't legally recognized marriages. There was no organized marriage equality campaign in the 1960s, although there was some conversation around the idea. So why do these people use the word husband so freely? Well, while marriage wasn't available as a legal right, it was still seen at the time as a model for happy, healthy, fulfilling relationships. So activists, who often went by the term homophile, sometimes advocated for same-sex couples to consider themselves married, to behave as though they were married, to use the language of marriage, even though there was no legal recognition. It wasn't unheard of in the 1960s for gay men to talk about husbands. Not husbands in the eyes of the law, but husbands in the eyes of the couple and the community. Throughout the middle of the documentary, when people talk about marriage and gender and the military, we're getting a little snapshot of what life was like for queer people half a century ago. This was filmed in the middle of the country's sexual revolution, and in the pre-Stonewall days of gay liberation. For people like this, freedoms like legal marriage would have felt unattainably distant, and other rights, like equal consideration for military jobs, were worth fighting for. And then there were newfound opportunities, like gender therapy, that would have been unthinkable even a few years earlier. Queer life was changing at a remarkably fast pace when this was shot, and of course, nobody in this documentary could have imagined how much it was going to change just 2 years later, starting at the Stonewall Inn, just a few subway stops away. But as important a document as The Queen is, it's worth pointing out just how much it misses. The bulk of the attention is on the white performers, with only 1 or 2 minutes spent with performers of color. Eventually, a black queen named LaBeija will steal the show, but for that, we'll have to wait for the last 10 minutes of the documentary. Harlow's most dramatic moment comes when she loses a wig, and everyone has to scramble to find a replacement.
I'm in a spot, and it's a matter of absolute life or death, Carol, that I get hold of a platinum blonde fall, and I mean life or death.
Don't worry, everyone. They get the wig. Harlow goes on, the pageant happens, Andy Warhol shows up to judge, and we get some shots of tense-looking contestants backstage that the documentary didn't even bother to introduce. One of them, and you only catch a glimpse of her at first, is LaBeija. As the pageant reaches its climax, Crystal is named third runner-up, and you can see the exasperation on her face. She's had enough. She walks off.
Crystal, where are you going? This is not the time to show temperament. Get back here and stay with the other finalists.
After Crystal walks off, Harlow's crowned and everyone cheers. Well, not everyone. With just a few minutes left in the film, we get an entire documentary's worth of story, and we see who the cameras should have been following the entire time.
She better get the hell back to Philadelphia because she's one of the worst. And where's Miss Sabrina? Because I'll sue the bitch. Did you sign a release? I will sue. No, I didn't sign a release. And if she releases any picture of me, I will sue the fool. She won't make money off of my name, darling. She can make it off of Harlow and all the rest of the fools that will flock to her. But not Crystal, darling.
At the time this was filmed, Crystal had just been crowned Miss Manhattan, which was no easy feat. Remember, going back to the 1800s, New York drag culture had elevated white performers and expected queens of color to lighten their skin. It was a huge achievement for Crystal to win a title, and she was well aware of the prejudice at the balls. At the pageant captured in The Queen, for example, not a single judge is a person of color. Crystal's fury stems from multiple places. First, there's the century-long racism of the drag balls, which have been keeping performers of color down since the 1860s. Then there's the obstacles that she personally faced in a system that still expected her to whiten her skin to compete. And then there's the fact that Harlow and Sabrina are old friends, which doesn't necessarily mean that the contest was rigged, but it doesn't exactly look good. Backstage, she really lets Harlow have it.
Get a picture with me and Harlow and we'll see which is more beautiful, darling. See, I don't say she's not beautiful, but she wasn't looking beautiful tonight. She doesn't equal me. Look at her makeup. It's terrible.
But Crystal also concedes this wasn't Harlow's fault. She might be the target of Crystal's anger, but it's not really what this was about.
Right, don't bother her. Don't bother her. It's not Harlow's fault. It's not her fault.
The whole thing is absolutely stunning and unforgettable, which is probably why Aja paid tribute to her on Drag Race.
Damn it, I'm beautiful and I know I'm beautiful.
Through West Sabrina, I will sue the bitch, darling.
Eventually, they're all cleared out with some help from the police, who impressively do not arrest anyone, and the next day, Harlow heads home. She's characteristically quiet, saying nothing to the filmmakers, just staring at her crown. The next few years would see Harlow's life dramatically transform. The Queen was a big hit, as independent films go, and was named Best Documentary at the Cannes Film Festival. Truman Capote approached Harlow about appearing in a film, David Bowie called her an inspiration, and in the early 1970s, she transitioned, moved back to Philadelphia, opened a restaurant called Harlow's, married, and as of a few years ago, was still quietly living there, happy to be out of the spotlight. Crystal's life changed too. She continued to do drag and compete, but in 1972, she and her friend Lottie created something new, a drag house. Inspired by fashion houses, drag houses quickly became like families, institutions where queer people could work together, take care of each other, help each other out when no one else would. Each house had a mother, and Crystal is recognized as the founder, the first mother of the House of LaBeija. Other houses followed in the 80s and 90s, the houses of Dupree, Extravaganza, and Ebony, among many others. It was thanks to those houses that New York developed a ball and pageant system that was captured 20 years later in the documentary Paris is Burning, and depicted 30 years after that on the show Pose.
Ballroom trains us to be safe, to be able to say, you know what, I'm strong enough to walk a ball, I'm strong enough to stand in society.
And of course, everyone's life was about to change right after the filming of this documentary, because 2 years later, the police raided the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village and touched off a riot that led to the modern Pride movement. Riots, outbursts, showing temperament, as Sabrina calls it, that's what it took to change the status quo. And just as happened when Crystal walked off, there's always going to be those who say, now's not the time to challenge a system that's holding people back.
It's in bad taste and you're showing your color and stuff. I am doing it bad, but I have a right to show my color, darling. I am beautiful, and I know I'm beautiful.
The Queen highlights one tiny fragment of queer life in the 1960s, one brief night that changed everything, at a point in history when queer life was changing faster than ever before. Crystal's experience at this ball led her to create something entirely new and bigger and better, and that's what we'll be talking about in next month's Culture Cruise, with a deep dive into Paris is Burning. But for now, land ho, we're pulling into port. Thanks for cruising along with us, and thanks to everyone who makes Culture Cruise possible with a pledge of support on Patreon. If you're enjoying these videos, head over to patreon.com/mattbaum to support the show, and check out the rewards like early ad-free access to Culture Cruise videos, books and stickers in the mail, and more. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an appointment with my dentist.
Your dentist could turn into a queen. Has anybody seen my tambourine?
Oh, hey, one more thing. If you want to know more about the history of the fight for marriage equality, check out my book, Defining Marriage, Voices from a 40-Year Labor of Love. It's an oral history of the fight for marriage equality from the 1970s up till today, and it's available now on Amazon.